Welcome, everyone. We're going to give folks a few minutes to join before we get started.
She's a really great and she tells everyone that we listened that we are the and she felt that she just said it so much that
So it looks like the participant numbers have started to level off, so we can probably go ahead and get started. Blake, do you want to kick us off?
Sure thing. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the OVS VAP Training Center webinar, Enhancing Your Services, Planning for Accessibility. I'm Blake Cush. I'm the Training and Outreach Unit Chief for OVS, and our Director, Elizabeth Cronin, is also with us here today, and she's going to offer some opening remarks shortly after I just cover a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is a part of a series of webinars that we offer through the OVS Training and Technical Assistance Request Program, or TARP, which you're going to learn a little more about in just a minute from our TARP providers at CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. They're fantastic, and we're excited for you to hear a little more about that as well. For the last few years, we've hosted a series of webinars designed to help you tackle some of the unique challenges and pressing issues that you and the programs you work for might be facing, and we're hoping that today is no different. So we hope you get the most out of this training opportunity from Olga and Sandra, who you're going to meet, and they're amazing. And should you want to go back and revisit what was covered, today's webinar is also recorded, and we will publish it on our YouTube training channel in maybe at the earliest by the end of today, if not sometime tomorrow. You can access those links and other resources on our OVS VAP training page, which is just ovs.ny.gov/training. It'll also be sent to you after the training's over as well. You'll get an email with all of that information and links. And then finally, as you do exit today's webinar, you'll be directed to, or you have access to, a link to be able to complete an evaluation survey on the presentation. QR codes will also be made available. Please take a couple minutes, give us your feedback. That feedback is incredibly valuable. We share it with our presenters. It helps us improve from one webinar to the next webinar. Sometimes they're simple, silly logistics like slow down when you're speaking, Blake, that sort of thing that are good feedback for us to hear. And we really do appreciate your time. It takes like 2 or 3 minutes to answer your questions for us. So please consider doing that. That said, I'd like to officially welcome Office of Victim Services Director, Elizabeth Cronin.
Thanks so much, Blake. Welcome, everybody. First, I would like to thank Blake and Rachel and the whole OVS training and outreach team. We truly think that they are the dream team. They are responsible for setting up webinars with our consultants and always do a great job. And I want to thank Talon, as always, and Mia and Allison from the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. They are our TTAC providers and the webinar organizers, and have been really doing a wonderful job providing real substantive content, and I hope content that's relevant and useful to all of you. These topics come from feedback that we get from you. So just like Blake said, it's really important that we hear from you about what's working and what's not working, so that we can make sure that we continue to provide content that is helpful. So today is a really interesting topic, and I'm going to let the puny folks introduce everybody, but we have Sandra and Olga from an organization called Activating Change. And this is a topic, about serving people with disabilities that is something that we really all need to talk about and we need to think about. The statistics are kind of grim about how vulnerable people with disabilities can be. And also the challenges that many advocates have in trying to find services that are appropriate for people with whatever the disability is, and also how to provide services for those that you encounter, because the needs can be very different. We're also involved in a needs assessment right now because we're really trying to examine where the needs and the gaps are and how we can do a better job of serving these populations. So I'm really excited to have Sandra and Olga here to present to us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Talon.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So before we dive in, I just want to give a very quick overview of the Training and Technical Assistance Request Program, or TARP. So individual victims assistance programs are able to request individualized training and technical assistance. It can be on anything from trauma-informed supervision to creating accessible organizations like we're going to be talking about today, and pretty much anything else. And if it's not something we're able to offer in-house, we're able to work with outside consultants to help make sure that you get the support that you need. And all of this is at no cost to you. So these are just a handful of the types of offerings that we provide. And there's a larger catalog that you can see our full list of offerings. And you also have the ability to select another topic not listed here and put in whatever topic that you might need training around. And to request these services, you do need to have your executive director or program director submit the request, but you can just send them the link to the catalog where you can look through, see what is available to them, and we'll include the links to these in the follow-up email afterwards, and then submit a short survey monkey kind of outlining what the request is, and then we'll reach out and get planning with you to get started. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olga and Sandra. I'm super excited to have them. They're from Activating Change, which is an organization that does really incredible work around working with folks with disabilities. And I will let them introduce themselves a little bit more. And one quick reminder, the chat is open, but if you have any questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function rather than the chat, just to help us stay a little bit more organized on any questions. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Talon. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here on this really important topic. My name is Olga Trujillo. My pronouns are they, she. And I am the Director of Leadership Development, Visibility, and Collective Healing at Activating Change. We're a new nonprofit that spun off from an existing nonprofit. And we work to end the victimization and incarceration of people with disabilities. And I'll turn it over. Oh, and I want to say one more thing. I identify as a person with a disability, and I like to try to destigmatize it. So I tell people what it is. So my disability is called dissociative identity disorder, DID, which was formerly known as multiple personality disorder. And I am typical for someone who has DID, but not stereotypical for someone who has DID. Okay, so that was my little public service announcement. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sandra.
Thank you, Olga, and thank you, Talon, for setting this up. Really excited to be in front of this audience. I think it's, again, a really important topic. My name is Sandra Harrell, and I'm the Director of Field and Capacity Building at Activating Change, which, as Olga mentioned, used to live within the Vera Institute of Justice there in New York City. Our work over the past 20 years has really focused on the victimization. Well, my work has focused on addressing victimization in the lives of people with disabilities and improving service delivery for survivors with disabilities. So a lot of what we will share with you today is based off of sort of working with communities all across the country to help them figure out what works best in serving survivors with disabilities. I think that's everything. Oh, I go by she, her pronouns, and I think that's everything I need to say about myself.
Okay, well, so I'm going to share my screen and advance the slides, and Sandra, you're going to start us off. So give me a second to like figure out which screen I want to actually be showing. This is always my challenge when we're doing webinars. So I want to, okay, so not that one. So 1 second. Try one more time. Okay, am I doing it right, Sandra?
You got it. Yep.
Awesome.
So
All right.
today we want to share with you information that will help you to better understand the context in which survivors with disabilities come into victim services. And so we're going to share information about disability, but we're also going to talk about ableism and how that shows up and how that impacts people with disabilities. And I like to tell people we'll spend the first sort of 2/3 of this kind of bringing you down. And that is just something that we can't avoid because the current state of the world when it comes to living in this world as a survivor with a disability is somewhat bleak. But we end on a hopeful note because we have seen over 100 communities across this country really being able to implement changes in their policies and their practices and their the way that they train their staff that have had incredibly important impacts on the lives of survivors with disabilities. So we will leave you in a hopeful place, but bear with me as I take you to kind of a bleaker place at the very beginning. So we're going to start with talking about disability. I think we're ready for the next slide. One of the things that we talk about is that, you know, generally, I think there's a very sort of monochromatic idea of what disability is. Even if you think about the universal sign for accessibility, it is somebody who uses a wheelchair. And so when we think about disability, we often are thinking about people with physical disabilities, possibly sensory disabilities. You might think about someone who is blind or someone who is deaf. But generally, actually, disability is a much broader category than that. Depending on the statistic that you are looking at or the definition of disability that you're looking at, it could, which is, you know, here in America, we go by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Based on their definition of disability, 1 in 5 people has a disability, but based on the World Health Organization's definition of disability, it's 1 in 4 people who have a disability. So this is a lot of people with disabilities that live among us. And that category of disability is incredibly broad. It includes people who have cognitive disabilities. These are disabilities that affect the brain's processing, the ability to process information. A cognitive disability does not always include an intellectual disability, but intellectual disabilities will have people with intellectual disabilities will also have cognitive disabilities. So you'll often see both intellectual and cognitive disabilities sort of collapse together in the same category. But we pull those two apart because we've seen in our work at this intersection of victimization and disability, we've seen people, especially survivors who have acquired cognitive disabilities, such as traumatic brain injuries, through either the domestic violence, well, definitely through the domestic violence, either through being hit on the head violently, or through strangulation. We pull those two apart because a lot of times people with cognitive disabilities won't have intellectual disabilities. And there's nothing wrong with having an intellectual disability, but the way that you work with somebody with a cognitive disability who doesn't have intellectual disabilities is different than how you would work with somebody with an intellectual disability. Intellectual disabilities are any disabilities that impact a person's ability to learn beyond a certain stage. This could be folks who generally intellectual disabilities are congenital, meaning they are present at birth. And it could be somebody who has Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, a variety of different disabilities that impact the person's ability to learn beyond a certain point. Physical disabilities are disabilities that are either congenital or acquired. So you may have a physical disability such as muscular dystrophy that is present at birth, or spina bifida, or you could acquire a physical disability through accidents or through aging. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then there's psychiatric disabilities, and these are disabilities such as anxiety disorder, DID, as Olga shared with you earlier, schizophrenia, depression, just disabilities that impact a person's mental health. And then finally, sensory disabilities. And these are disabilities that impact any of the five senses. But generally, when we hear about someone with a sensory disability, we're thinking about people who are hard of hearing or deaf, or people who are blind. But there are other sensory disabilities. For instance, traumatic brain injuries can make somebody lose their sense of smell or their sense of taste. And then there are physical disabilities that can make you lose your sense of touch. So that category in and of itself is very, very broad. And then the entire category of disability is incredibly broad. But one of the things that I think has been a part of the narrative around disability for very, very long is that somehow disability is outside the norm, when in reality, it is a normal part of the human condition. When you think of like 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people in your community, in your neighborhood, who has some sort of disability, it's hard to say that it's an aberration. It is part of the human condition. And the only thing that has been an aberration is our treatment as a society of people with disabilities, treating people with disabilities as if they are somehow less valuable than people without disabilities, treating disability as something that must be cured or changed, and not something that is, again, a very normal part of the human condition. And do you mind going to the next slide? Because I think I've gotten a little ahead of myself. So yeah, here we go. So society, so historically, if you look at the way that our society has treated people with disabilities, there tends to be, at the very early in history, disability was really treated as if it was a punishment. So you can see very early on, narratives around people with disabilities were steeped in something negative, and steeped in a belief that people with disabilities were somehow bad, or having a disability is very, very bad. Eventually that evolved into thinking about disability as something to be pitied in someone. Again, not necessarily a punishment from God, but not good. It's something that really inspires sort of the charity model of disability, thinking about people with disabilities as as people who are less than and in need of help. This has really and I'll get into this a little bit more as I talk about ableism, but this model of thinking about disability has really created a enduring narrative that people with disabilities are that the accommodations that they require to participate in society are burdensome, are hard, that they live very, very, very difficult lives, and the people around them who have to support them have it really difficult. It's not, we think of like pity and charity as kind of kind ways to approach people with disabilities, but in reality, it reinforces an idea of people with disabilities being less than. And so we want to interrupt that as well. And then side by side with the pity charity model has emerged the medical model of treating people with disabilities. Now, I don't want to in any way take an unnuanced approach to this. We work at the intersection of victimization and disability. And a lot of the time we are talking about people who have acquired disabilities through very traumatic events. That acquisition of a disability is not going to be something that they're going to necessarily immediately be able to embrace, nor somebody who has acquired a disability through an accident or through aging. We're not saying that the fact that you look for medical interventions is problematic. I don't want to in any way say that. But the way the medical community talks about and treats disability assumes that it is inherently a state that should be fixed. The assumption that disability is something that should be intervened, fixed, eradicated. And this shows up, for people who are, who get pregnant at certain ages. I think it's like past 35. My sister, when she got pregnant, she had to do all of these tests in advance because she was sort of a late maternal age. And there's counseling that goes along with that about what if we find some abnormalities in your fetus. That counseling in some ways suggests that an abnormality in the fetus is a good reason to sort of terminate, for instance. And that is, again, everyone's choice. You do what you want in your body. But that messaging it goes real deep in the medical community. And it all of these models really deeply inform the way that we treat people with disabilities and results in a very entrenched ableism in our society. And I think we're ready for the next slide. So we get very ableist attitudes. Those ableist attitudes result in a significant amount of marginalization. A lot of times when we're talking to victim service providers about serving victims with disabilities, we'll often hear, we don't see a lot of people with with disabilities. And what I'll say is that's because ableism has been very effective. Ableism has done its job. People with disabilities have been made invisible in our society because we have put them into special education. We have put them into Special Olympics. We've put them into congregate living situations that are sort of outside of the mainstream society. And that has resulted in people with disabilities having really no real opportunity to fully participate in our programs and our services, even though, as Olga will share, they experience really high rates of violence. And you have a direct tie between ableist attitudes towards people with disability and these incredibly high rates of violence. So next slide. So just thinking about the way that ableism shows up in our society. Next slide. Again, marginalization. Our built environments were designed around people without disabilities. And so oftentimes when you see courthouses or other places that sort of signify justice and participation in our society, you often see steps going up to those places, you know, Congress, like you think about all of the different places that are symbols for us, and they are accessed by steps. This isn't necessarily because the designers of our society were saying we want to necessarily keep people with disabilities out, but when you don't think about people with disabilities in the design of your services, the result is you will create obstacles to their participation and marginalize them from your services. Next slide. Another way that ableism shows up and sort of creates a really direct line towards victimization is through the exploitation of their labor. So up until 2020, that's 3 years ago, up until 2020, every state in the country allowed people with disabilities to be paid pennies on the dollar for their labor. Pennies on the dollar. This was codified in our legislation. So you think about how deeply entrenched our devaluation of people with disabilities is, that we said, hey, we have minimum wage that you have to pay every single worker in this country. At the very minimum, you have to pay people this minimum wage, except for people with disabilities. Them, you can pay pennies on the dollar. And this, the barrel of monkeys that used to be, I don't know, I'm older than a lot of people, but there used to be like these barrel of monkeys, and they made millions of dollars off of these barrels of monkeys. Those were created by people with disabilities in sheltered workshops. Again, they were making pennies on the dollar. And there was one self-advocate that I worked with who got her first job, was so excited to get her very first paycheck because she wanted to take her family out to dinner. And her first paycheck after working 40 hours was less than $20. Just think about that and think about how that sets people with disabilities up for victimization, specifically sets them up for trafficking, because if you are already in your mind think that your labor is worth nothing, you may not think twice about getting paid far less or getting paid nothing for your labor in certain work situations. And also, if you have very few opportunities to make a living wage because of this sort of exploitation, you may think that a sex trafficker's proposition is actually more lucrative than what you can make in our general society. So just thinking about that. And then next slide, please. There's also a significant amount of powerlessness that is built into the lives of people with disabilities. This is an image of a psychiatric institution where it was standard practice to completely restrain people. Today in a person's individualized education plan, it is allowable for the school to use restraints on a child with a disability if it's part of their IEP. Powerlessness goes into their adulthood as well, where many people with disabilities can lose their ability to make their own decisions through being victimized. So, a lot of times people with disabilities are afraid to even tell anyone what is happening to them, because that could lead to someone in their lives going in and claiming that they are leading a dangerous lifestyle, and therefore they need to have a guardian in place. And that guardian then can take control of that person's entire decision-making process, depending on how whether it's a plenary guardianship or just a financial guardianship. So there's like a real threat to losing your ability to make your own decisions, because you're a person with a disability. Also, for you, we all work in victim services. When we are working with people, with survivors without disabilities, our sort of commitment to confidentiality, to their ability to decide what comes next. Do they want to involve the police? Do they want to get a protection order? Do they, would they prefer to go a whole different route? That commitment runs deep in our movement to end domestic and sexual violence. But for people with disabilities, every single state in this country has a mandatory reporting law of abuse of vulnerable adults. And these mandatory reporting laws were built around abuse of older adults. And so there was always sort of a line of demarcation, right? Like at 65 and up, that's when this might come into play. And there's a lot of nuance there about abuse of older adults. For people with eventually they just sort of lobbed people with disabilities into that, and there was no real clarification. Mentioned before, this is a really broad category of people. And this whole concept of and people with disabilities just kind of got thrown into these mandatory reporting laws without any real thoughtfulness about okay, but if somebody with a disability can go and ask for help from victim services, do they really need a whole system coming into their lives and making decisions about them? That sense that people with disabilities don't have a right to their own power creeps in every single time we pass legislation, policies, anything, design curricula or training or any of those things without people with disabilities at the table, because those ideas of ableism are deeply entrenched in us as well. So I think I'm ready for the next slide. All of this, as I mentioned, it creates a situation in which people with disabilities are targeted for violence at incredibly high rates. And what I think happens for people with disabilities in a disproportionate way is that the people who hurt them rarely see any sort of accountability. There's oftentimes, these are headlines that we pulled together years ago for a presentation. I asked my colleague to pull up more, and we see them, they make it into the headlines, but it has to be pretty darn egregious for crimes, victimization of people with disabilities to make it into the public consciousness. And even when that happens, a lot of the sort of immediate reaction is, oh man, who would do that to a person with a disability? And my answer is a lot of people would do that to people with disabilities, because we have systematically devalued the condition of disability through all of those sorts of narratives. So I'm going to turn it over to Olga at this point to talk about sort of what the stats tell us about all of this.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sandra. Okay, so now we're going to spend some time examining what domestic violence and sexual violence in the lives of people with disabilities and deaf individuals look like. We'll also spend a little bit of time discussing implications for your work. So we'll examine the statistics, as Sandra just noted, the unique ways that gender-based violence shows up against people with disabilities, and how it impacts survivors with disabilities. We'll look at the barriers to accessing assistance and support. But before we get started, I have a caveat because I'm a lawyer and I'm trying to use my law degree every day. So I always have to have little disclaimers and caveats. The research is really limited around the incidence and prevalence rates of violence in the lives of people with disabilities. Because a lot of times what they do is they lump everything into one category of violent crime, and they don't tease out domestic and sexual violence. And also they lump in the categories of people with disabilities, as Sandra explained. There is a whole range of different experiences of disability that are just kind of clumped together. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the statistics. So what we do know is that people with disabilities experience victimization at much higher rates than people without disabilities. A 2021 Bureau of Justice Statistics report showed that people with disabilities experience victimization at somewhere nearly 4 times more often than people without disabilities. That women who experience intimate partner violence are more than twice as likely to also report a disability. That 14% of men with disabilities reported experiencing sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. And that's compared to 4% of men without disabilities. So it shows you that sense that in gender-based violence, that women are more likely to be victims is a little different when you're talking about people with disabilities, that men are also highly likely to be victims, men with disabilities. And so 49% of people with developmental disabilities were assaulted 10 or more times. It's a huge, staggering number. 20% of deaf adults have experienced physical abuse by an intimate partner, and 15% of deaf adults have experienced forced sex in an intimate partner relationship. These are staggering numbers. And because people with disabilities experience so much victimization, service providers who work with victims will likely work with people with disabilities, whether they know it or not. And disability service providers are likely encountering people with disabilities who are also survivors of victimization, and they won't always know about the victimization. So as such, victim service providers and disability service providers, first responders, attorneys, and many other professionals need to understand victimization in the lives of people with disabilities. So the vast majority of abusers are known and hold positions of power and authority in the lives of people with disabilities. 44% of abusers have a relationship with the individual because of their disability. And so that means that perpetrators can be caregivers, whether they're paid or not. They can be personal care attendants. They can be transportation providers. And that's what's different for people with disabilities. And then there's all the things that are the same for people without disabilities. They can be members of their family, boyfriends, girlfriends, or acquaintances. So what we know about violence in the lives of people with disabilities is that there are a lot of similarities with gender-based violence against people without disabilities. So most survivors without disabilities will report that following abuse or sexual violence, they might experience fear of retaliation, and or retribution. We hear that from people with disabilities. Often survivors without disabilities fear they will not be believed when they tell someone. And again, this is something we hear from survivors with disabilities as well. We also hear from survivors of violence in general that they're ashamed, that they feel responsible for what happened to them. And this again is true for people with disabilities. Survivors without disabilities often don't know about safe and supportive resources in their community. And this is also true of people with disabilities. These are common experiences across survivors generally. But what we see in the lives of people with disabilities, there are some dynamics that are very unique to them because of their disabilities. These are common experiences across, so for instance, what we know at a cultural level for people with disabilities is that there is a systemic denial of information about what constitutes a healthy relationship in the lives of people with disabilities. And this starts very early on within their family and also within their educational system. There's almost an assumption that people with disabilities shouldn't be in relationships or will not be in relationships. So no information is shared with them about what constitutes a healthy relationship. Additionally, we see for people with disabilities that they're isolated and exploited and marginalized through systemic oppression. And this has layers into their experience of violence and oftentimes contributes to the higher rates of violence in their lives because of the fact that they are isolated and marginalized from society. And that puts them at risk and being targeted for violence. Then also at the societal level for people with disabilities, there is a significant lack of confidentiality. This is partially due to mandatory reporting laws that are on the books in all 50 states. In some states, the mandatory reporting laws are really clear. And in other states, it's very murky. I think, Sandra, you like to say it's as clear as mud. And what happens in some organizations is that they may interpret their mandate and report any incident that they hear of, which means that people with disabilities in some states have no confidential avenue for seeking support or resources following a victimization. Additionally, disability communities tend to be small and close-knit. This is particularly true for deaf communities. This can compromise confidentiality as well. Then for people with disabilities who have a legal guardian, either a full guardian or just someone who looks over their money, again, this can compromise their ability to maintain confidentiality of what happens to them. So other unique dynamics is that people with disabilities will have a strong, realistic fear of institutionalization. So abusers exploit the fears that a lot of people with disabilities have. For example, most times people with disabilities have worked most of their lives to live independently in a community. And the thought of having that taken away from them can be just too much. They may refuse to tell anyone anything ever again because they feel like having a disability and then being victimized has stripped them of their independence. Institutionalizing people with disabilities was the norm in the not so distant past. And people with disabilities know that it is always a possibility, maybe even greater than the fear of re-victimization would be the fear of reinstitutionalized. I mean, I've been a person with an acquired disability for most of my life who's never been institutionalized, but I know it's a possibility. So it is something always in the back of my mind is what am I going to say? How am I going to say something about this? Sandra, did you want to add something?
This is Sandra. Yeah, just adding in here that it's not an irrational fear, because if a mandatory report gets made and the adult protective service worker deems that the person is living in an unsafe situation, they could, while they may not be in one of the institutions of the past, they could be put into a long-term care facility. We have a self-advocate that we've worked with for many years who, because of neglect by a personal care attendant, she's lost her independent living situation because she had to go to the emergency room after being left in her wheelchair overnight, and because she developed blood clots. And then once she got put into the emergency room, she ended up being hospitalized for a long period of time. And by that time, when she got back to her independent living situation, she needed more personal care services than our system deemed that she was allowed to have. And then she ultimately was deemed not being able to live on her own independently anymore. And she's currently in a long-term care facility. So it is not an irrational fear when we talk about that fear of institutionalization.
Yeah, and that's a really big piece too, that for that next bullet. So that self-advocate was part of a group that meets once a month with other people with disabilities in it. And just in hearing about her experience, it kind of sends ripples through the group. So think if the person abusing you is the person providing you personal care and other services, then if you report, you're going to lose that personal care attendant, that personal care service. And without it, you may not be able to live on your own and then become, be in a situation that's similar to the self-advocate that we work with. And then also you lose things like transportation. And so oftentimes people with disabilities may not even know that what's happening to them is abusive and or criminal. If you think about it, if you haven't been taught, if there is this compliance culture for people with disabilities, they have been taught their lives that that people are in their personal space, caring for them, and also that they haven't been taught to set boundaries. So people can exploit that with people with disabilities. And they often have people in their personal space. They're taught and encouraged not to set boundaries. And so when someone exploits this compliance, a lot of times people with disabilities don't know that what they experience is wrong or criminal. So here we go. All right. So some barriers to services and healing. Victims with disabilities face unique barriers to disclosure, healing, post-victimization services, and the criminal legal system process. And there are unique dynamics on the system level. Again, we talked about the lack of confidentiality due to legal requirements, such as mandatory reporting and guardianship laws. But also what we'll see is that disability organizations are often ill-equipped to address victimization of people that they serve. Disability organizations are designed around creating access for people with disabilities, advocating for access, possibly helping them find gainful employment or doing workforce training. They were not designed around responding to domestic and sexual violence in the lives of people with disabilities. So their first reaction often is, that's someone else's job, or that's not my lane. And we know that people with disabilities are often very connected to the disability organizations in their community, but not connected to the domestic violence and sexual violence programs. So if the disability organizations are not equipped to serve or respond to victimization that is experienced in a non-victim blaming, non-re-traumatizing way, that may shut down the only avenue for support that the survivor may have. And then we also know that victim service organizations were not designed necessarily around the needs for accessibility by people with disabilities. This is true in the physical construction of the buildings. And we know a lot of times victim services are located in donated spaces that the community has given, like an old historic building to, or a program is located through local government. So very rarely are we getting donated spaces that are universally designed for the highest level of accessibility. So the physical space is often inaccessible, but also when someone makes initial contact with a victim service organization, that there might not be communication accessibility either. So that's an issue as well to be taking a look at. A lot of victim services do their initial intake over the telephone. And for people who are deaf or people who have disabilities that affect communication or cognition, this isn't an accessible way to participate in those services. And then once they get into the services, there's oftentimes concerns that are sprinkled throughout their policies and procedures within the organization, that there isn't accessibility. There may be expectations around medication or doing chores, or when you are in services that a person with a disability just would not be able to do. So there are often a whole array of barriers to access, both in the communication environment and in the physical environment and the social and policy environment of these organizations. And then there's an important consideration about how related systems like adult protective services and criminal legal system advertise their response to survivors with disabilities in the aftermath of victimization. This includes the fact that a lot of times, just on the face of having a disability, they may be deemed as lacking credibility by law enforcement. We have a project right now where we're developing training for law enforcement around improving their responses to survivors with disabilities. And in our needs assessment, we found survivors who have been treated as in the system as if they didn't know what actually happened to them, and in other ways shown that once the person figured out they had a disability, that their information was second guessed or questioned. And so it shows that there is a lack of credibility, a sense that people in our criminal legal system and other related services, that they don't think that people with disabilities know the experiences that they have had. So, okay, sorry, having trouble moving. There we go. So barriers exist in domestic and sexual violence programs, healthcare settings, the criminal legal system, and other areas. And like I said, physical, communication, and attitudinal barriers, like the issue of thinking that people with disabilities don't know their experiences. Service providers oftentimes lack knowledge of disability in general, and policies in place may prevent survivors with disabilities from using those services. So because of all that, people with disabilities often have difficulty engaging with service providers, and oftentimes policies and procedures may act to exclude them. So when you think about those barriers that exist in disability programs for survivors and barriers to disclosure of violence and abuse, that is mandatory reporting or lack of privacy. And in some situations, the program might be serving both the abuser and survivors, or it might be the abuser that is right there with that person with the disability while they're trying to access the services for what's happened to them. And also then there's fewer transportation options that may impact safety planning, for example. So the barriers, and I also wanted to make a note about the barriers to services for healing for deaf survivors. So for domestic and sexual violence around deaf people, there are a few key ways that perpetrators take advantage of the smallness of the deaf community. So there's about 500,000 deaf people in our country, and in every community where there is an actual deaf community, you are going to find that it is a small group of people, not only small, but also a group of people that deeply value their community, their traditions, their values, the fact that they have a network of friends. So when someone is perpetrating domestic violence or sexual violence against them, they may threaten the deaf survivor with the loss of those friends, of that community, or they might try to manipulate them into silence to say, hey, if you say something, I'm going to be kicked out. I won't have this connection. So there's both, it works both ways. And also, abusers may steal or destroy communication or adaptive equipment so that the survivor isn't able to call for help. They put spyware on their communication and adaptive equipment and track them using spyware. And that's an important thing to keep your eye out for. And finally, if the person who is abusing, who is perpetrating domestic violence is hearing or grew up in a hearing family, they may have the ability to speak, to be oral, and they may use that privilege. And it's called hearing privilege, to be able to say when the police come, for instance, and manipulate the police into believing them and not the survivor that needs an interpreter. So being able to communicate in the law enforcement language in a way makes them able to form some sort of rapport with law enforcement that then puts the survivor at a disadvantage and also kind of paints the survivor sometimes as the person with the problem, as opposed to that person being the person who's causing harm. So I'll stop there. It's a lot, and it's as Sandra warned in the past, it's a lot of kind of gloomy information. So I'll turn it back to you, Sandra, to see if you can pick us up.
This is Sandra. Yes, absolutely. I would. I wanted to respond to a couple of things. So in the same way that a hearing abuser might leverage hearing privilege, they're sort of leveraging beyond hearing privilege autism, right? Like the sense that being able to hear is normal, the right way, all of that sort of stuff. And so because hearing people have internalized that message as well, a hearing law enforcement officer may very well be like, oh yeah, I'm going to talk to the hearing person because that's easier for me. I can have direct communication. I don't have to wait for an interpreter, that sort of stuff. And as Ivory mentioned in the chat over here, Ivory has said that they've escorted someone and had the law enforcement officers sort of want to speak directly to Ivory versus to the victim. And so Ivory had to redirect the law enforcement officer to that. And I was commenting in the chat that this is very, very common, because another way that ableism shows up in our society is by treating people with disabilities as if they are permanent children. Just think to yourself when you have heard particularly of people with intellectual disabilities, how people might be referring to them. If you think on it, you've probably heard references of like, yes, she's 25, but she has the mind of a 10-year-old, or she has the mental age of a 7-year-old. You'll hear that. It's very, very common, and that gets deep into the way we subsequently start to treat people with particularly intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, because we then, as Olga mentioned, deny them information about sexuality, deny them information about healthy relationships, assume that nobody would ever try to do any of that stuff to them, not take seriously any allegations. So those are two sides of the same coin, autism and ableism, in the sense that we end up deferring to the non-disabled person or deferring to the hearing person in those situations. And I also wanted to, so that we are all on the same page here, explain some of the language that we've used. There's a question in the Q&A about self-advocates. So you'll hear us use people with disabilities, deaf people, people with intellectual disabilities, people with IDD. When we say self-advocates, we're very specifically talking about people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. This is a movement, the self-advocacy movement really started in like the 1960s. I believe in Sweden, where there was a community member who was just like, you know, all of these programs designed for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are being run by parents. And what are parents going to do? Parents are going to, my mom tells me I will always be her baby. She doesn't care how old I am. She says that to me, you will always be my baby. So parents necessarily are going to be paternalistic. They're necessarily going to treat adult children with disabilities in particular as children. And so this person was just like, we need to create opportunities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to fully participate. And that movement caught on and is called the self-advocacy movement. And it's really training and educating people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to advocate on their own behalf. That doesn't tell you a lot about the issues affecting people with disabilities, then like just the fact that like being able to advocate on their own behalf is a big deal, then nothing else will. So as we mentioned early on, we have probably properly bummed you out at this point. So now is our opportunity to leave you with the hope that you, as people who are working in victim services, can do something about this. There are concrete things that you can do today, tomorrow, and 5 years from now that begin to really remove these barriers. You hold that key. And Olga, go ahead and advance that slide. And I think you need to step away for just a second. So my understanding from Taylin is that a lot of you are in leadership positions. And so we really wanted to talk to you about ways that leadership within organizations, particularly victim service organizations, can support change. And I hope we've made the case for you that if you aren't currently serving people with disabilities, then you are missing a core audience for your services. These are not, these are not people who experience victimization every once in a while. As Olga mentioned earlier, people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, for them, sexual violence is probable. It's not a possibility, it's a probability. And so if we're not designing services to be able to meet the needs of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as other disabilities, we're really kind of not meeting our mission. So here's how you as leadership can begin to support that change. Budget for accessibility. I know that I work at a domestic and sexual violence program. When I first began my career, it's sort of where I got all of my best training and best learning. And I also know we were on a shoestring budget. We wanted to go to a conference. 5 of us would share a hotel room. We'd all drive to that. It'd have to be within driving distance because our programs didn't have extra. We weren't flush with cash. So I get that. But there are some things that cost money. And so you want to make sure you have a line item for those things. That includes interpreters. Putting information into Braille for a very long time with the onset of technology like screen readers, voice to text, all of that sort of stuff. We actually saw people within the blind community no longer being taught Braille. Because, sighted people were like, well, gosh, they got this technology. What do they need to read for? And what it did is it left a whole generation of blind people illiterate. So there is a big movement in the blind community right now of pushing for teaching blind children, teaching people who are blind, or adults who are blind, Braille, so that they can continue to read. And so, while Braille sort of fell out of fashion, we are hoping to see it make a big comeback. So having a budget in your organizational budget that supports stuff like that. In your capital campaigns, thinking about really building into that campaigns around addressing physical accessibility of your location. If you know for a fact that you have steps leading up to your front door, or that you have a narrow entryway, or you don't have the automatic push button for your entryway, any of those sorts of things, that we're not shaking our finger at you. We understand you inherited this building. This building wasn't designed specifically to address the needs of people with disabilities. But now that you can begin to build into your capital campaign appeals for funding to change those physical spaces. You can also work to promote a culture of inclusion within your organization. And what that means and looks like is that you're looking at your outreach brochures, you're looking at the training curricula that you're doing in schools and in your community, you're looking at your volunteer training, your staff training, all of that. And you're saying, okay, are people with disabilities included? Can we go back to the other slide? Sorry, I was just doing a quick overview of these things, and then we'll get into the resources. No, that's okay. That's okay. So also you're making sure that people with disabilities are just represented, that you're not only images, but in examples of abuse. You're hiring people with disabilities. And so that really means that you're looking also at gaps in your policies and procedures to make sure that you are not unintentionally creating barriers to hiring people with disabilities. But there are other policies and procedures that you're going to want to address as well, which we will get into. And I think we've already kind of laid the groundwork for this. If you don't already have one in place, mandatory reporting policies. You want to have a policy and procedure in place around guardianship, all of that sort of stuff. You want to, as leadership, really dedicate staff time to attending training on serving survivors with disabilities. And then really actually dedicating time to addressing accessibility barriers. There's what we call this is an access review. And we recommend doing an access review on an annual basis. And because when I worked at a shelter, I know that we would do things, just little things week by week to sort of make the place feel more homey, right? We were in a very institutional setting, but we would bring in stuff from home, we bring in rugs, we bring in plants, we bring in all sorts of stuff just to create a more homey atmosphere for the residents of the shelter. And can guarantee we were creating barrier after barrier after barrier in doing that. So it's not to say that you cannot bring those sort of homey feel into your spaces. We highly recommend that. It's just balancing that with, is that rug a trip hazard? Does that tree or plant need to be right there because it creates a barrier within the hallway? Can we move it out of the space? you know, that sort of stuff. So creating a barrier, an access review, and then conducting that review. And then importantly, building partnerships with disability organizations and deaf organizations in your community. So now I think I'm ready for the next slide. So I talked about budgeting for accessibility. Specifically, you want to research those costs for accessibility in your community and make sure that your line items match those costs. Depending on where you are, your interpreters may range anywhere from $65 an hour to $100 an hour. It just depends on where you are and what the market rate is for that. Braille houses, it depends again where you are and how you might be able to find a Braille house that's not in your community that is a lot cheaper, but then you also have to think about shipping. So those little sorts of things to think about when you're budgeting for accessibility. And I mentioned conducting an annual access review. I have semi-annual here, but that's annual will be fine, to review those barriers, and then that helps you to actually plan for your next fiscal year as well. I think I'm ready for the next one. We have a few resources to help you promote that culture of inclusion that I was talking about. We have an End of Use of People with Disabilities webinar series that we do on a monthly basis. That talks about a range of different things. Sometimes they're philosophical in nature. We just hosted an end of use webinar that featured Tarana Burke and Najma Johnson, and they talked about freedom dreaming and what the implications are in the lives of survivors with disabilities. But we also have really concrete ones. Olga just did one with an autistic survivor in April that was really concrete. It was like, here's what to think about in services for autistic survivors. Go ahead, Olga.
Yeah, that's one I wanted to mention, that the autistic survivor is also works for the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So we're talking about kind of how do you, what kinds of things do you think about you need to do to serve autistic survivors in your sexual assault services.
Right. So yes, and then we also have some resources to help you to be able to advocate for accommodations within the system, the criminal legal system. So we have a Just Ask toolkit that comes with posters and palm cards to just be that you can order as many as you would like from us, and we'll send them to you. And then when you're out there doing legal advocacy work or any of that, you can bring those to your local law enforcement, your legal aid department, or your district attorney's department, and be like, it's just some things to think about when you're working with survivors with disabilities. It's also great to have these on hand within your own organization, because that means when a survivor with disability does come in and you have to go do some legal advocacy with that person, you can bring that accommodations toolkit along to be like, this is the standard practice. Okay. We also have a tool to help you be able to identify the gaps that you currently have in your services. And this is what is called our performance indicator measurement system. And it is an online system, again, totally free to you to use. And it requires no experience in conducting evaluations. It draws upon information within your organization that you likely already have in place, with just a handful of things that you actually have to collect from others, but we give you like a guide for those questions. And it really helps you to be able to see like where you're doing great and where you might want to put more resources. And that's helpful, because a lot of the times you may think, oh, we've got really strong partnerships, but based on field standards, you may get a lower score there. And that's just a kind of aha moment for you of like, I guess maybe we do need to work on building better partnerships with disability organizations. So you can access that on our website as well. I think I'm ready for the next slide. And then again, really looking at policies and procedures. This is a place where at the intersection of victimization and people with disabilities, if you don't have the organizational policies and procedures in place, people are going to fall through the cracks. And so you really want to look at mandatory reporting requirements. You are creating a mandatory reporting policy that creates as much of a buffer for your organization to not have to do a mandatory report as possible. And that, because I know you're like, it's the state law for mandatory reporters, but you can really, if you take a scalpel to that law and apply it to your own victim service organizations and really look at, for instance, VAWA confidentiality rules or other confidentiality rules that you have in place, you can sort of create a space there where you don't necessarily have to do a mandatory report. And if you do a mandatory report, create a policy that actually is supportive of survivors with disabilities, autonomy, and independence. So really looking at your own policies and procedures around mandatory reporting, around working with somebody who has a legal guardian. Here, what you're really looking to is to figure out, okay, first of all, how do I determine guardianship is actually in place? And the short answer is, if there is a legal guardianship in place, there will be paperwork. If someone doesn't have paperwork, they don't have a legal guardianship in place. The other thing is to determine the level of the guardianship that is in place. By best practice, I only want to say this isn't actually what happens, but best practice is that if somebody has a guardianship placed on them, it's supposed to be the least limiting of that person. So if we went by best practice, most guardianships would be as limited as possible. So usually that's like guardianship over somebody's finances, which is problematic on its face because that is a system that gets abused left and right in order to steal someone's benefits. But that's a topic for another day. And we're supposed to be in the happy time of our presentation. So let me say, focus on that. So looking at your guardianship policy to make sure you determine when guardianship is in place, what level of guardianship is in place, and then making sure that your policy outlines ways to try to have a conversation with the survivor without the guardian in the room, if in fact it's a plenary guardian. Making sure you have clear policy in place around service animals, that service animals are in fact allowed in services that really define what a service animal is. There is a difference between service animals and emotional support animals. The ADA specifically says that service animals are either dogs or miniature horses. I know, wouldn't have guessed that second one, but miniature horses can perform a lot of the same sort of responsibilities as the service dogs, and they live a lot longer. So those are the two types of animals that can be legally defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act as service animals. Emotional support animals, much broader category. You are legally required to allow service animals into your services. If you are running a shelter or anything else, you may also, under fair housing, be required to allow emotional support animals in as well. If you're not required to allow emotional support animals in, you as an organization should have a conversation about whether you want to have a more liberal approach to this and allow the emotional support animals in, or only allow service animals in. You want to have a policy addressing personal care attendants in service, just giving guidance to they are allowed to come into services and like what part of the service are they allowed into? How are you going to work with the survivor with the disability around setting those boundaries, et cetera. And then having an accommodations policy in place is critical. This is making sure that you have a policy outlining when accommodations should be made. And by that, I mean in what amount of time. So if you're in crisis, just think about it for yourself. If you are in crisis and you need something you need something that would help you be able to participate in a service that will help you to get out of the crisis, how long would you want to wait for that something? Would you want to wait for that something for 72 hours? Probably not. So really thinking about your resources, but also the survivor and trying to center that survivor with a disability and naming an amount of time in which you will get that accommodation that is fair to that person with a disability. I am ready for the next slide. We have a ton of resources on our End of Use website. I'm not going to go into every single one of them, but we do have an online course that was developed for direct service providers. This includes conducting physical access and safety reviews, making sure that your program materials are accessible, and building accessible and safe services through policies and procedures. Those are all free to you. All you have to do is register with our website and you can take those courses. So I encourage you to make that available to your staff. Like that's one way that you can provide training to your staff is just by showing them some of these free courses. Next. And then finally, you really want to build those partnerships within your organization. We have, again, a lot of resources. The two that we highlighted for this particular presentation is supporting crime victims with disabilities from crisis to healing. In that one, we actually have a decision tree that we created to allow people to figure out, okay, if I'm working with a survivor with intellectual disability and they need SSI benefits, bam, it'll sort of point you in the right direction for that. So there is one resource. And then a long time ago, we had been working to build these collaborations between disability organizations and victim service organizations for a number of years. And we sort of distilled what we had learned through that in a resource that we call Forging New Collaborations. It was written several years ago, but I think a lot of what we put in there still applies. I believe that brings us to the end of all of that. Yeah. So we do provide technical assistance, but here we are ready to answer any of your burning questions.
There we go. I'll stop share. And I think we were answering questions along the way, but just wanted to check and see if there are any questions. If you could put it in the chat or in the Q&A. And I just want to remark that you can't even tell that Sandra and I have dogs because there was no barking happening during our presentation, or at least none that we could hear.
As long as FedEx or UPS doesn't come by, Iggy no longer barks during my presentations.
Yeah.
He did the first few years. He had no self-control, but
Yeah. I have 3 dogs that range between the age of 1 and 3, and there's lots of barking that happens in our house.
Are there any questions or anything that you would want us to clarify?
Oh, looks like there's a question. I saw the toolkit online. Is it just one or are there several parts that need to be printed separately?
The toolkit was designed, okay, which toolkit? I'm sorry. We have lots of toolkits. In fact, we call every resource we create a toolkit. So if you're talking about the Supporting Crime Victims with Disabilities toolkit, that was designed to be an online toolkit to be used online. If that's not something you can do because you're in a rural area and you need an actual physical version of it, you can reach out to us and we can send that to you. And then the Just Ask toolkit, there are several different versions. There's one for advocates, one for law enforcement, and one for attorneys. So there's 3 different versions. If you want those, you can of course send people the electronic link, but you can also reach out to us and we'll send you physical copies so that you don't have to print them out. So that's that.
Yeah, those are all the questions I see. And can OVS offer this webinar for specific organizations?
So if you have a training request around this particular topic, we can definitely do that. In the follow-up email, you'll receive the request form for TARP. And if it's something that we are not able to do in-house, we're certainly happy to collaborate with Activating Change to bring them on board and see what we can make happen that way. And while we're waiting for any other questions to come through, I just want to very quickly share my screen to announce 2 upcoming webinars that we have. We have one in June that will be facilitated in-house by CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance on managing yourself and up with the trauma-informed DEI lens. And then in September, we're going to take a little break for the summer. We're going to have a webinar on creating trauma-informed language access services facilitated by the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. So I definitely encourage you to register for those. And like I said, we'll send out the request form if you would like to receive individualized TTA for your organization.
And you can find a lot of what we talked about on our End Abuse PWD website, including a lot of the webinars that we've had. There's some really awesome webinars that we've done this year in particular.
Yes. And I'll also say I just dropped the link to the evaluation survey in the chat, and you should also be directed to it automatically when you leave the webinar. So again, we really do use that feedback to help improve our webinar series and other training. So we really encourage you to fill it out. Cool. Any other final questions that folks have, or anything, Sandra or Olga, that y'all wanted to share as final words?
No.
This is Sandra. I'm just thrilled. Thank you so much for letting us get in front of this wonderful audience. And thank you to the audience for just your attention and your commitment to this issue.
And thank you both so much for coming. We really appreciate it and found it very useful. Like,
Awesome.
anything you would like to say to wrap up?
No, just give us a day or so to get your, links to the recording for today's session. And then, yeah, stay tuned for the email that comes out as well. But please, please, please do your eval. Sandra, Olga, that was wonderful. We can't thank you enough. This is tremendous. And we really do appreciate your time.
Our pleasure.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay.
Bye.